So an English class wouldn't be complete without learning about literary devices or types of figurative language. It really just depends how you refer to them, but they all do the same thing in different ways. And it's figurative language, meaning it's not literal, and so it just provides a deeper meaning for the text. And so these are some literary devices that are used a lot in Catcher in the Rye. I also expect you to refer to at least some of them in your essays on Catcher in the Rye. But you should remember them in general because they help you analyze and understand a text more fully. So this is something you just simply have to study and master that way. It's memorization. And I know some of you guys might be like, well, why do I have to memorize it when I have Google? Yeah, you always have the internet at your hands. However, sometimes the internet does go out. And even if you do have access to it, it's just faster to know it off the top of your head. You don't want to spend time trying to find things that you can just have memorized because you just don't have that much time. You want to get to the analysis part of your assignments faster than just like, what was that again? So that's one of the reasons why I encourage memorization. And I will also have a Quizlet or a Kahoot or a Nearpod on this as well, just to make it more interesting for you that you can refer back to and kind of have fun with. So an allusion with an A, not an illusion, allusion, is an indirect reference to a person, place, thing, or idea of historical, cultural, literary, or political significance. It doesn't go in depth. So just the vocabulary word quixotic comes from the first novel in Western literature that is a modern novel, which was Don Quixote, written by Cervantes in Spain. And so that precedes any modern novel in the English language. And Don Quixote, he changes, and that's what makes it a modern novel. He goes from basically insane, seeing things and living in kind of a fairy tale land to realizing that he was wrong the entire time. And so quixotic means stupid, impractical, foolish, etc. So that's an example of an allusion. You can also allude to different historical figures. I'm trying to think of famous ones. It really just depends. Like if you've watched Bridgerton, it takes place in 1813, which is the year Pride and Prejudice was published. It's all about the marriage market. And so basically it's an extended allusion to Pride and Prejudice and the works of Jane Austen. That doesn't make it bad. It just, you can compare the two and it's pretty interesting. So an apostrophe. We have the actual apostrophe, which is a type of punctuation, but it is also a figure of speech, sometimes represented by an exclamation. And so when you use apostrophe, they're speaking to someone who is not present or is dead, or they're speaking to an inanimate object. So in Macbeth, this character is talking to a dagger, which is apostrophe. Is this dagger which I see before me the handle toward my hand? Come, let me clutch thee. I have thee not, and yet I see thee still. Which, is kind of an interesting passage in general, but we don't have time to analyze it further today. It seems kind of sexual, doesn't it, when you think about it? Characterization. It's the construction of a fictional character, and there's a few different ways of to do characterization, and we will go over those later. But basically an author can directly characterize a character, and so that means they tell you this character has brown hair, this character likes to knit. Or you could have indirect characterization where the author writes the character knit 5 hours a day every day. And so then you can assume that that character likes knitting. You might assume incorrectly, maybe it's that character's job, but at least it's there. Flashback. It's a scene set in a time earlier than the main story. So in the TV show How I Met Your Mother, it's all a flashback, just various flashbacks. And it tells the kids how he met their mother, but ultimately, I don't know, the ending's rather interesting if you're waiting for to really see a love story. Narration, it's how you narrate a story. And so there can be an omniscient narrator, meaning the narrator knows everything about all the characters. That's written in third person, and the narrator can see into all of the characters' heads. Then there's a limited narration, and that can be in first person, and that narrator only sees from one character's perspective, and it can be unreliable. So that's kind of the two big ways of narration in literature. There's also second person, where the narrator's always talking to the reader, but that's a lot less common. Plot. It's the main events of a play, novel, movie, etc. And we have the main parts of the plot, which should be reviewed for you. We have exposition, which is the setting and time of the place, and it might introduce the problem. Then you have the rising action, where the tension builds, followed by the climax, where the problem hits a head. And we have the falling action, where the story starts to be resolved. And lastly, the resolution, which in French is denouement. So that's how the story ends. And so those are the main parts of plot. Just because we have it like that, though, doesn't mean it's always in chronological order. Sometimes you have flashbacks and flash forwards and tangents, and so it can go every which way sometimes. So it just does not have to be chronological. And you can also have different perspectives, so you can have like one chapter from one character's perspective that goes chronologically for like 1 week. Then the second chapter is another character's perspective that goes back to the beginning of the week and does it again. Game of Thrones is kind of written like that. Okay, so point of view, that is connected to narration. And it says who is telling the story. So Lord of the Rings, for instance, is third person, and it's outside the story. So you can also have just a third person narrator who doesn't go into anyone's heads. So tone and mood are often confused. Tone is the author's feelings, and it's the attitude that the author adopts in regards to a specific character. And it can portray a variety of emotions, and it helps the reader ascertain or determine the writer's feelings towards a particular topic. So Harry Potter by J.K. Rowling has a positive, inspiring tone. The mood is how the audience or the reader feels emotionally while they're reading. Foreshadowing, that hints at what is going to happen. And so it's usually not like super obvious. It's subtle. And so like he had no idea of the disastrous chain of events to follow. Usually it is the narrator talking about what's going to happen, but the characters have no idea. So the reader knows something, and the audience does not. Dun, dun, dun. Metaphor and simile are hopefully literary devices or figurative language that you learned about in elementary school. Basically, both compare two things. Similes use the word like or as, and metaphor does not. So now we're going back to some characterization. And these are important as well because they can help with the plot, they can help determine the problem of the story or add tension, and they also help you know who's a main character and who's not. So a static character does not change. So Sherlock Holmes or James Bond. Now both of those characters are the main characters in a story, and so just because it's a static character does not mean that they can't be important or a main part of the story or even the protagonist. Usually they're not, but sometimes they are. A dynamic character changes throughout the narrative. And so we have Gulliver and Gulliver's Travels, Neville and Harry Potter, lots of characters, Luke Skywalker, etc. We have an unreliable narrator. So this is when it's usually written in first person, and you can't always trust what the narrator is saying. So one of the classic examples of an unreliable narrator is Holden Caulfield, and you will see why when we're reading this book. If you haven't read The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime, it's a really cool mystery book about a kid who has autism and solves the mystery. And so Christopher Boone is that unreliable narrator. I think he's a little more reliable than Holden, though. Symbolism, the use of symbols to signify ideas and qualities. So a rose is a symbol of love. The American flag symbolizes the United States. Red usually symbolizes passion or anger. Green is usually innocence or sickness. Colors have a lot of symbolic meaning. Many different flowers have symbolic meaning. Even like the beach represents extroverts, and mountains or forests tend to represent introverts. So there's tons of symbolism out there. And some of it is unique to a specific culture, and some of it is universal. It really just depends. Stream of consciousness is a method of narration that describes the thoughts of a character in real time, which is pretty weird to follow, but it's kind of cool. So one of the excellent examples is from Mrs. Dalloway. And so it just kind of goes from idea to idea without, transitions, and it doesn't really make sense, but that can add a lot of richness to a text for interpretation. Okay, diction is the style of speaking or writing. It's the word choice. Usually good diction is good writing, bad diction or poor diction is bad writing. And this basically argues that word choice and syntax are very important. Not to confuse diction with syntax. It's the set of rules in a language. So it's the order in which we place nouns and verbs, in a nutshell. They are closely related. Diction refers to the word choice, and syntax determines how the chosen words are used to form a sentence. So, diction, think word choice. Syntax, think how you organize it. A complex diction means it's going to have a complex syntactic structure. The more complex your ideas, usually the more complex the sentence structure is going to be. And that's not to confuse the audience or reader, it's to better convey your ideas. So that's why you can know grammar for a long time, and as you get older, you still have things to learn, and things are tricky. So we have ambiguity. Which basically means that there's some confusion, and it can be purposeful or it can be unintentional humor. So each of us saw her duck. Are we talking about like a rubber ducky or a bird, or that she actually bent down and moved her head lower or something like that? So there's two different ways to interpret that, and you just have to know which is which is kind of interesting. So literal and figurative, and this is the last slide if you were worried. Literal has been thrown around as a term for a long time, and people say like, oh, I literally died when I heard that. That's not what literal means. I think some dictionaries include that as a connotation or a secondary definition of literal, which rather ticks me off. Literal means it's actually happening in the most basic sense. So right now, I am recording a video, literally, okay? But I guess it doesn't sound as interesting if you say, oh my gosh, I figuratively fainted when I saw that actor, people just don't talk like that. But when they say I literally did something, that's a figurative way of exaggerating what they're talking about. Anywho, try not to do that. It ticks me off as an English teacher. Just use literally. Like I am literally hungry all the time. That works. Figurative language. There's so many different types of figurative language, but it's basically not happening exactly. It's comparisons or references, and it provides new insights. It helps us, our communication, be more effective, persuasive, and impactful. You have alliteration, which is when all the first letters of each word start with the same sound, like same sound, alliteration. Images, onomatopoeias, it all appeals to our senses. And if you pay attention to language every single day, we use figurative language all the time. We just don't realize it. And so a lot of what we say is figurative, and that can make things harder to interpret sometimes. It can make people interpret things slightly differently, and that's okay. So, anywho, we also have connotation, and that means there's an implied meaning apart from what is said explicitly. So, he is such a dog. Dog is figurative language for shameless or ugly. A funny example I like is Netflix and chill. Your generation, that means something probably inappropriate since none of you guys are allowed to date until you're at least 25. But when I say Netflix and chill, it means I'm going to binge watch Netflix with my knitting and tea or coffee. And so it literally means to relax. Or, or chill, like if you wanted to watch Netflix outside in the snow, like that would be literally watching Netflix and chilling. So depending on the generation, you'll have different connotations for what Netflix and chill means. I know that's kind of a shocking example, but I use it because you won't forget it that way. And so these are just some literary devices that you will need for Catcher in the Rye.